Decades after the war, the rumor still survived, and writers pointed to hundreds of FBI documents about Hitler in Argentina and to the CIA's large collection of material connected to the hunt for him. The source says those intelligence files were often more interested in the people attracted to stories of Hitler's survival than in the idea that he was alive and well in Argentina, while later forensic work turned back to the physical evidence. Modern forensic scientists went to Russia to examine the teeth, and the source cites work in the European Journal of Internal Medicine, saying the dental remains were genuine and that the research supported Hitler's death in 1945. Yet another examination of a skull kept in a Russian museum, and said to be Hitler's, concluded that the skull actually belonged to a woman who was probably in her 40s when she died. Nearly 80 years after Hitler's death, the source therefore judges it extremely likely, almost certain, that he died in the bunker and that his body was burned in the garden, while still saying that absolute 100% certainty is impossible. Then the story resets to the first day after Hitler's reported death, when at about 9:30 in the morning, Germans heard that an urgent and disturbing announcement was coming from one of the country's last shortwave radio stations, based in Hamburg. Before the announcement, the station played gloomy Wagner, music closely associated in the source with Hitler, and then Grand Admiral Karl Donitz told listeners that Hitler had fallen. Donitz followed with a long speech, praising a heroic death while avoiding factual detail, and the source says the decision to delay surrender for the sake of pride helped extend the fighting until May 8, 1945. But what had actually happened at the end of Hitler's life was not the same as the heroic radio story, and the source shifts from propaganda to the bunker, where Hitler's body had already been burned and reduced to ash. Joseph Goebbels moved around the bunker in the Chancellery Garden, hoping the Red Army might shoot him, after an attempted ceasefire was rejected. The source says he saw no reason to keep living in a defeated Germany. One of the last men to see Goebbels asked why he did not flee like others, and the visibly despondent Goebbels answered that a captain could not abandon a sinking ship, and that he had decided to remain. He also said he had nowhere to go and could not survive with his young children, and while other senior Nazis might try to escape Germany, the source portrays Goebbels as staying beside Hitler to the end. A day after Hitler's death, Goebbels had an SS medical officer give large doses of morphine to his 6 children, and he and his wife Magda later died and were burned in the Chancellery Garden, though the cremation was poorly done and the Soviets later recovered remains, while elsewhere the mayor of Leipzig, his wife, and other city officials held a final gathering at City Hall and ended it with poison. The source then describes a doctor linked to concentration camp projects sitting with his family. That doctor detonated 2 grenades, and across Germany thousands of civilians took their own lives within roughly 72 hours of the radio report that Hitler had died in battle, as the reality of defeat overwhelmed both loyal supporters and others. Many chose death rather than capture by the Red Army, or a life marked by defeat. And by the second day, the news of Hitler's death had been accepted and broadcast around the world, including by the BBC. The BBC carried Donitz's announcement but warned that it might be propaganda designed to help Hitler escape, so even a formal death report did not convince everyone that the Nazi leader was really dead. After a war Hitler had begun and the mass murder of Jews and other people he considered inferior, the source asks whether news of his death really produced the simple, universal celebration one might expect. The source opens this phase with Norwegian novelist Knut Hamsun praising the dead Hitler, describing him in exalted terms as a fighter for humanity and a preacher of justice among nations. Hamsun even presented Hitler as a reforming figure of the highest order, while the source answers that Hitler did reshape the world, but in a profoundly negative way, and notes that not everyone celebrated his death, as the New York Times published a long obituary. That obituary condemned Hitler's ideas about an Aryan race, recalled his frustration at failing to become an active artist, and described him as evil for secret killings of opponents and people suspected of opposition. It also held Hitler responsible for the brutal destruction of Jews, and added personal details, saying he was a vegetarian, slept very little, had few female friends, and lived with an intense preference for neatness. The source says the obituary writers may not have known about Hitler's drug use and the effects of high-dose medications, while Britain's Daily Express greeted Germany's announcement as the news everyone had hoped would prove true. A Boston paper printed a blunt line that Hitler would finally speak no more, while other American newspapers reported US forces moving through Austria and suggested peace might come by the weekend, as Winston Churchill had indicated. The Salt Lake Tribune came closest to the suspicion many people felt, arguing that Hitler could not accept unconditional surrender, and that his encounter with death might therefore have been arranged to become a heroic legend. The source admits it could not shake the feeling that Hitler might be somewhere nobody expected, and on the third day, after the reported death, the world's attention turned toward the Allied leaders who had fought him. Joseph Stalin, whom the source also describes as responsible for millions of deaths, showed little interest in celebrating the end of his greatest wartime enemy, and instead became visibly grim. His reaction was essentially that the man was dead, but that it was unfortunate he had not been captured alive. In Washington, President Harry Truman addressed Hitler's reported death at a press conference. When a reporter asked whether US officials knew Hitler was dead, Truman answered yes, although he admitted they still did not know exactly how Hitler had died, and insisted only that they had strong authority for believing the Nazi dictator was gone. Truman would not identify that authority, and the source says it was not Stalin. Although Stalin privately accepted Hitler's end, he never publicly declared that he believed Hitler was dead. Instead, Stalin encouraged stories that Hitler had escaped to Argentina, Spain, or somewhere else, and his distrust led him to order the elite Soviet investigative unit SMERSH to obtain physical verification. On May 12, 1945, SMERSH sealed the Chancellery Garden and bunker area and began a systematic search. After 3 days of digging, the source says the burning with gasoline and fire had made the remains extraordinarily difficult to recover. The remains associated with Hitler and Eva Braun seem to have almost vanished, and the source notes the view that Stalin may have used the uncertainty to serve his own political aims and preserve tension among the other powers. Whatever his motive, Stalin kept denying that Hitler was dead, even when he met Truman personally at the Potsdam Conference in July 1945. By the fourth day, Hitler was dead and Germany was losing, but the fighting had not stopped. In his will, Hitler had named Grand Admiral Karl Dönitz as his successor and president of Germany, a choice that surprised Dönitz himself. Other Nazis reportedly wondered who Dönitz even was, and Dönitz later suggested that Hitler had chosen him because he believed a rational man with an honest reputation as a sailor might still be able to negotiate a workable peace. Dönitz tried to negotiate with the United States and Britain rather than the Soviet Union, because he believed the Soviets would reject any deal and wanted blood and spoils from defeated Germany. The source connects that attitude to the enormous Soviet wartime losses, while also stressing that Stalin remained furious, deeply skeptical about Hitler's death, and suspicious of American and British intentions. It also says Stalin had little interest in sharing whatever he learned about Hitler with other leaders, and by the fifth day, American General Dwight Eisenhower and British Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery rejected the kind of surrender Dönitz wanted. The Americans demanded unconditional surrender by German forces everywhere and wanted Germany demilitarized, with its army, weapons, and military vehicles reduced to the minimum level allowed under the settlement. The source says the Allies had strong reasons not to trust Germany, and with no negotiated peace, German troops kept fighting while Dönitz ordered his men to carry out Hitler's written instructions to destroy as much German infrastructure as possible. At the same time, the source describes Soviet soldiers looting German homes and killing civilians, while American, British, and French forces would not enter Berlin until July. In the middle of that collapse, one of the most famous Nazis surrendered, Hermann Wilhelm Göring, whom the source remembers as a leading wartime figure and one of the most valuable men in Hitler's system. On the 8th day, May 8, 1945, Donitz finally accepted Germany's surrender on every front, which the source presents as preferable to sending more German soldiers into the terror they feared in Soviet prisoner of war camps, and as the culmination of total defeat. This defeat, the source says, was not only military and political but moral, and on the 9th day, Stalin demanded another formal signing ceremony after Donitz had already accepted Germany's unconditional surrender. The second ceremony was meant to make Germany's defeat unmistakable. Donitz yielded, but the source reminds us that World War II itself was not yet over. Only Germany's part in it had been brought to a complete end. Donitz later spent about 10 years in prison and lived to the age of 89, carrying defeat and regret, while by the 10th day, Stalin had become increasingly paranoid because he knew that some Nazis were escaping Germany. Stalin wanted the fugitives, their intelligence, their scientific knowledge, and the power to punish them. But above all, he wanted Hitler and imagined the possibility of Hitler hiding in South America and trying to build a Fourth Reich. The thought that Hitler could survive and someday return kept Stalin searching for certainty. He distrusted Britain and the United States and told his inner circle that capitalist encirclement was continuing. As time passed, fear and wartime trauma remained across Germany, while disbelief in Hitler's death stayed alive in the victorious countries. And by the third week, the collapse of the Reich brought another major Nazi fugitive into view. On the 23rd day, Heinrich Himmler, the former German police chief and one of the most powerful Nazis, who had turned against Hitler near the end, shaved his mustache, wore an eye patch, removed his glasses, and tried to disappear among low-ranking German soldiers. He moved toward the British zone in northern Germany, but the disguise failed and British forces captured him after he claimed to be an ordinary soldier, using the name Heinrich Hitzinger. The guards were not fooled because they had already seen similar false papers, and the tension at the checkpoint grew until Himmler realized that his disguise was no longer protecting him. He removed the eye patch, revealed a normal eye, and identified himself as Heinrich Himmler, leaving the British with no doubt that the man in custody was a senior Nazi figure. The source compares fleeing Nazis to rats in a burning house, panicked and uncoordinated, and places Himmler's capture at a checkpoint in northern Germany near Bremerford. With Goebbels dead and Göring already detained, the source calls Himmler an architect of the Holocaust, one of the most wanted Nazis still at large, but the celebration of his capture did not last. Rather than face imprisonment and trial, Himmler ended his life by biting a concealed cyanide capsule. Yet about a month after Hitler's reported death, and after Germany's surrender, Stalin was still being asked the same question: was Hitler alive? Stalin continued to say that Hitler was probably living in Spain or Argentina, and every new statement was repeated by American newspapers and consumed by a public fascinated by the possibility. The source says that before long 70% of Americans believed the Führer's heart was still beating somewhere in South America, while many people in Britain also suspected that Hitler had not truly disappeared. About 6 weeks after Germany's surrender and the end of the war in Europe, the Soviet Union finally staged its great victory celebration before the Kremlin, welcoming soldiers home from a conflict the source says had cost 27 million Soviet lives. From Lenin's mausoleum, Joseph Stalin received the crowd's honors and watched Red Army units throw symbols of the Nazi government onto the ground in Red Square. In the second month after Hitler's death, the Americans captured Hitler's dentist, Hugo Blaschke, in Austria and kept him imprisoned for years, while Stalin's Smersh investigators looked deeper and found that Blaschke had an assistant named Käthe Heisermann. Soviet intelligence learned that Heisermann was still in her Berlin apartment, living as though nothing had happened, and that she had extensive experience with Hitler's dental treatment. Stalin's investigators took her from the apartment and brought her to a place where she was shown a bundle of dental remains that the Soviets said belonged to Hitler. Years later, Husermann wrote that she held the dental bridge in her hand, searched for a distinctive mark, found it, took a breath, and said that these were Adolf Hitler's teeth. Despite that identification, she was placed in solitary confinement. In 1951, she was sent to a Siberian gulag because, according to the source, Stalin did not want the Americans or British to know that someone had definitively identified Hitler's remains, and even a single tooth could give him political leverage. Stalin later died, while Husermann nearly died in the gulag before being released in 1955, under an agreement with West Germany, and returning home expecting that her family would be overjoyed. Instead, her family had declared her dead, and her husband had remarried, leaving the source to frame years of suffering as the price she paid for having once worked on Hitler's teeth. By the 6th month, attention had shifted to the ruined German capital. After visiting Berlin, British Air Marshal Arthur Tedder described the city as totally destroyed and suggested that the ruins should be preserved like a modern Babel or Carthage, a monument to Prussian militarism and the horrors of the Nazi regime. He described a city that seemed dead, with mile after mile of ruins and uninhabitable buildings, and the source says that after the European War, Germany appeared to be little more than wreckage, grief, and regret. The scale in Berlin was enormous. The source lists 48,000 buildings destroyed, 23,000 severely damaged, and 172,000 lightly damaged, after 50,000 tons of explosives had fallen on the city. In the summer of 1945, the New York Times expressed hope that Berlin's destruction might mark the beginning of a renewal of German civilization, while American journalist William Shirer struggled in his diary to find words for what he saw. He described a great capital destroyed beyond recognition, a once powerful state that no longer existed, and a conquering nation now reduced to piles of rubble. Only 5 years earlier, a source says, that nation had behaved with arrogance and brutality, and with confidence in a master race mission. Another diary entry dated July 7, 1945, recorded the unsettled atmosphere of the ruined city. By the 7th month after Hitler's death, Stalin still claimed Hitler was alive, even though he knew about the dental evidence, and the claim remained persuasive enough that Eisenhower repeated it before later withdrawing. Why Stalin kept saying this is left unresolved. Perhaps he distrusted the dental identification. Perhaps Husermann might have lied to protect herself, or perhaps he simply refused to accept the evidence. The source offers darker possibilities, that Stalin wanted to create confusion or strengthen control, and notes that after the war, he refused to share Hitler's forensic evidence with the Western powers. That secrecy helped prompt British historian Hugh Trevor Roper to investigate what happened around the bunker at the time of Hitler's death, and to prepare a report reconstructing the events. Much of the familiar account of the burning in the Chancellor Garden, the source says, came from that investigation, but even this did not stop the escape rumors from surviving. The rumors endured for decades, with writers citing hundreds of FBI documents about Hitler in Argentina and large CIA files connected to the hunt for him. But the source says the CIA was often more interested in the people attracted to stories of Hitler's survival than in the idea that Hitler himself was living comfortably in Argentina. And it describes the agency as watching people who remained interested in him. Later, forensic scientists traveled to Russia to inspect the dental remains, and the source cites work in the European Journal of Internal Medicine saying the teeth were genuine, and that the research supported the conclusion that Hitler died in 1945. At the same time, a skull in a Russian museum that had been presented as Hitler's was examined by other scientists, who concluded that it actually belonged to a woman who was probably in her 40s when she died. So almost 80 years after Hitler's death, the source reaches a careful verdict. He very likely, almost certainly, died in the bunker and was burned in the garden. But 100% certainty remains out of reach. From there, the story turns to the spring of 1945 and the problem of defeated Germany. The Allies now faced the question of what to do with a defeated country, whose people had taken part in persecution and killing, especially of Jews. While many Germans had supported the system enthusiastically for 12 years, and others had simply looked away. Who should be punished, and how could Europe be rebuilt after total destruction? The source estimates about 60 million deaths in World War II, while noting that the exact number is disputed, and gives the Soviet Union at least 27 million casualties. The Soviet Union suffered the greatest losses in absolute terms, while the source says Poland suffered the heaviest proportional loss, with 6 million dead in the war and Holocaust, about 17% of its population, alongside severe losses in Yugoslavia, Hungary, France, the Netherlands, and Greece. Cities across Europe celebrated the end of the war and welcomed Allied soldiers, but the suffering did not simply stop. The source says 13,000 prisoners died after liberation, and that more than 3 million German prisoners of war were held in the Soviet Union. Nearly 8 million German prisoners were held by Britain and the United States, and because facilities could not contain such numbers, the US Army created temporary camps along the Rhine, where up to 2 million former Wehrmacht and SS personnel were crowded behind barbed wire. Food was scarce during the first weeks, the source says, and by late spring 1945, the temporary camps had been closed, while many German soldiers were forced to clear German mines along the Atlantic Wall. The source then broadens its view, arguing that World War II changed humanity's course, not only because it was the most destructive war in human history, but because it was also a clash of ideologies and blocs that had developed over a long period. In the source's timeline, the Third Reich was destroyed, fascist leaders disappeared in tragic ends, Hitler took his own life, the racist Nazi ideology died with him, and the victorious Allied bloc inherited the task of shaping the post-war world. Those victors tried, through punishment, retribution, and doctrines, born from the experience of war, to prevent anything similar from happening again. But the source closes this chapter with a harder question. Who can guarantee that a war like this will never return? The source answers that final question with uncertainty, then shifts openly into alternate history, noting that in the time frame from which it was speaking, Hitler would have been 134, and asking us to imagine a world in which Nazi Germany, Japan, and Italy had won the war. It begins from the Nazi invasions that succeeded early in World War II and imagines Germany emerging as the dominant world power, with any major resistance answered by overwhelming violence. In this imagined outcome, entire cities could be massacred, Jews would be sent to concentration camps and killed, and Europeans labeled as inferior would be enslaved for mass labor in Germany's war machine and agriculture. The source then imagines Hitler imposing laws designed to establish Aryan domination, comparing them with policies it associates with Stalin and mass famine, and projecting the deaths of millions. It goes further, describing a hypothetical plan in which more than 50 million people would die before Aryan colonization could proceed over a period of years and before native populations in conquered territories were removed. Before such colonization, much of the population would be used as slave labor, reproduction would be controlled, and the source imagines abortion being made compulsory for non-Aryans. For Aryan mothers, by contrast, abortion would remain illegal because German women would be expected to produce as many children as possible, while the source imagines mass sterilization or killing connected to births, judged unhealthy or affected by hereditary conditions. German forces would exploit fertile land across Europe and use the continent's broad agricultural regions to feed a growing German population as the Nazi state tried to reshape Europe's population. If that demographic project succeeded, the source imagines that within decades much of Europe would consist of German descendants, changing what it meant to be European or part of Western civilization, and making Nazi Germany the dominant sponsor of fascist governments. Children would grow up increasingly indoctrinated into violence and loyalty to the ideology, while education would be compulsory and controlled by the state. History and the humanities would be taught only through the party's racial worldview, helping fascism become normalized as a governing theory. Then the source turns from Europe to its next question: what would happen in Asia? In that imagined world, Asia belongs to Japan, and the source pictures the rising sun flag flying over Los Angeles City Hall, with the major American naval base at San Diego nearby. It imagines Imperial Japanese naval officers taking control of surviving American aircraft carriers, now crewed by Japanese sailors, while Japanese forces push inland toward Las Vegas. The scenario continues with the seizure of Hoover Dam and the cutting of water and electricity across the American Southwest as a way to force the United States to submit, before the source turns to what Japanese rule across Asia might look like. The source imagines that empire as even more brutal than European colonial rule, driven by a worldview it compares with Nazi racial thinking, and by a belief that other Asian peoples were less than fully human, while Japanese farmers and business people moved into temperate parts of the mainland. Unlike the Nazi vision of replacing much of Europe's population with Aryans, the source imagines Japanese settlers remaining a substantial minority rather than replacing native populations everywhere. That would force the empire to rely on local bureaucracies to administer conquered societies, while a small Japanese elite controlled the capitals, an arrangement the source compares with British rule in India. The source says Koreans were among the peoples culturally and genetically closest to the Japanese, drawing an analogy with Germans and the British. Yet it still imagines them being treated as inferior within the empire. Under Japanese control, Korean culture would be suppressed and assimilation encouraged. But because there would not be enough Japanese people to staff the entire empire, the system would eventually need Korean participation. The source imagines Koreans being recruited across the imperial structure and compares the pattern with Ireland under the British Empire, where culture was suppressed at home while Irish people were recruited in large numbers to sustain imperial power. At the same time, racist contempt would keep Korea economically subordinate, with policies designed to prevent industrial development and competition while preserving a cheap labor supply. The source compares such restrictions with British policies toward Indian shipping and textiles and imagines similar measures being used to block the growth of native industry. In this scenario, the Asian economies familiar to the source, including Indonesia, Taiwan, and Vietnam, would not develop in the same way. Instead, Japan would exploit local people in rubber plantations, mines, and other resource industries. Resources would flow out of the conquered territories, and Japanese industrial goods would be sold back to them, allowing Japan to enjoy one of the highest living standards in the world, while Germany and Japan did influence across Asia and Europe. The two powers might respect one another, isolate themselves, or eventually betray each other, and begin another war for supremacy. But the source ends by admitting that there is no reliable way to know what the world would actually have looked like if Germany and Japan had won.